Welcome back to Shadow of Empires. If you've watched our previous videos on the hidden dungeons of Topkapi, Cleopatra's seduction of Caesar, Theodora's rise from prostitution to empress, and Qin Shi Huang's mass burial of 3,000 women, you've seen power operate in almost every form. You've seen psychological manipulation. You've seen strategic seduction. You've seen ruthless mass murder. You've seen the complete erasure of human agency. But today's story reveals something different, something that exists in the gray space between all of these extremes. Because sometimes power doesn't operate through force or manipulation alone. Sometimes it operates through forbidden desire, through the crossing of boundaries that society has established, through the transgression of social rules that are designed to maintain hierarchy and control. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on notifications. Next week, we're exploring a topic so provocative that it fundamentally challenges how we understand the nature of gender and power. We're investigating accounts of women throughout history who achieved power not through seduction or manipulation, but through something far darker, through the deliberate cultivation of fear, through the systematic elimination of rivals, through sexual dominance combined with political ruthlessness. But first, you need to understand what happens when the rigid social hierarchy of an ancient empire begins to crack. What happens when women from the elite classes develop desires they're not supposed to have? What happens when forbidden attraction becomes documented history? It was August 24th in the year 79 AD. The city of Pompeii, located near modern-day Naples in Italy, was going about its daily business. The streets were filled with merchants and shoppers. The forum bustled with political activity. The thermae, the public baths, were crowded with citizens seeking relief from the summer heat. The amphitheater was being prepared for upcoming gladiatorial games. It was an ordinary day in an ordinary Roman city. Ordinary, that is, until Mount Vesuvius erupted. The eruption was catastrophic. A column of superheated ash and pumice rose into the sky. The sky darkened at midday as if night had fallen. The temperature rose dramatically. The ash fell so thickly that people couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. People fled in panic. Some tried to escape the city. Others hid in their homes, hoping the disaster would pass. Within hours, Pompeii was buried under meters of volcanic ash and pumice. By the next morning, the city was gone, entombed, preserved, frozen in time. But here's what made Pompeii unique. Unlike other cities that were destroyed and then rebuilt over centuries, Pompeii was never rebuilt. The site was abandoned. The ash hardened. The city remained buried for nearly 2,000 years. And when archaeologists began excavating in the 18th and 19th centuries, they discovered something extraordinary. They discovered a city preserved exactly as it had been. The buildings, the streets, the artwork, and the graffiti. Walls throughout Pompeii were covered in graffiti. Writing carved or scratched into the plaster. Writing painted onto the walls. Writing that represented the actual thoughts and words of the people who lived there. Political advertisements, love declarations, insults, jokes. And among this graffiti, archaeologists discovered something that would fundamentally challenge how historians understood Roman society. They discovered evidence of relationships that were supposed to be impossible. Relationships that violated every social rule. Relationships between women of the elite classes and gladiators. Gladiators occupied a unique position in Roman society. They were simultaneously celebrities and outcasts. They were enslaved men, prisoners of war, criminals condemned to the arena. They were the lowest of the low in terms of legal status. They had no rights. They could be killed at will. They were considered less than human by the law, and yet they were also the most famous people in Rome. The crowds loved them. The people cheered for them. They had admirers who followed their careers obsessively. They became wealthy if they survived long enough. They accumulated possessions and sometimes even their freedom. But this contradiction was precisely what made them dangerous to the social order, because they represented a crack in the hierarchy, a space where someone of low status could become famous, powerful in a way, desirable. And for women of the elite classes, forbidden to marry beneath their station, forbidden to associate with the lower classes, forbidden to have any kind of sexual or romantic relationship outside of marriage to men of their own social level, the gladiators represented something transgressive, something dangerous, something forbidden that made them all the more desirable. Rome was obsessed with maintaining social hierarchy. The entire structure of Roman society was built on the idea that people occupied specific social stations and that crossing those boundaries was not just inappropriate but destabilizing. A woman of the elite classes was supposed to marry a man of equal status. She was supposed to bear children who would inherit her family's wealth and status. She was supposed to maintain the family line and the family's position in society. Any deviation from this was a threat to the entire system. Adultery was a crime. If a married woman had sexual relations with a man other than her husband, she could be prosecuted. She could lose her legal status. She could be exiled. In extreme cases, she could even face death. But the crime wasn't simply about infidelity. It was about the threat to the family's honor and status. If a woman had children with someone other than her husband, it created confusion about inheritance. It created the possibility that family wealth and status could pass to someone not of the intended bloodline. It threatened the entire system of property and inheritance that held Roman society together. But across the walls of Pompeii, carved into the plaster that would be preserved for nearly 2,000 years, there was evidence that some women were willing to take this risk, were willing to violate these rules, were willing to cross these boundaries. One graffito, translated and studied by modern archaeologists, reads, "Celadus the Thracian, fighter with net and trident, makes the women swoon." Another, more explicit, reads, "I love a girl named Iris. She wrote this herself." Yet another, scratched near the amphitheater, reads, "Brutus the Gladiator made me come here." And then, most tellingly, if you seek Philomena, she belongs to Marcellus, the gladiator. These weren't written by random people. Many of them were written in elegant script, suggesting they were written by people of education and status. Some bore the marks of being written deliberately, repeatedly, as if the writer was making a point. Some were written in locations that suggest they were written by people who had access to the interior of houses and buildings, not just public spaces. They were written by women of status, deliberately leaving evidence of their connections to gladiators. Archaeologists have found graffiti specifically in the houses of wealthy families that references local gladiators by name. They found evidence suggesting that women from these households attended gladiatorial games regularly, which itself was unusual because upper-class women were supposed to be confined to domestic spaces. They found references to specific gladiators in multiple locations throughout the city, suggesting that these men had admirers who were actively tracking their movements and documenting their existence. But the graffiti is just the beginning of the evidence. Archaeologists have also found what they interpret as love notes written on lead tablets, a common method of sending secret messages in ancient Rome. These tablets were thin sheets of lead rolled up and sealed, meant to be hidden. Some of them, discovered in Pompeii, contain declarations of love directed at specific gladiators. They contain requests for meetings. They contain expressions of desire. They contain the language of forbidden romance written by women who clearly understood they were transgressing. One such tablet, carefully preserved and studied, reads essentially, "Meet me at the house of Maius. I long to see you. My husband is away." The tablet was found in what archaeologists believe was the house of a wealthy family. The language suggests a woman of education and status arranging a secret meeting with a man of low status. The fact that she mentions her husband's absence suggests she understands the risk and the impropriety of what she's doing. She's deliberately planning an encounter that violates her marriage vows and every social rule governing her behavior. The question that emerges from this evidence is, why? Why would women of privilege, women who had every advantage that Roman society could offer, women who lived in luxury and comfort, women who had their every need met, risk everything by pursuing relationships with men of the lowest social status? The answer reveals something crucial about power and desire, because desire, it turns out, doesn't follow the rules of social hierarchy. Desire isn't constrained by the boundaries that society establishes. Desire operates according to its own logic. And sometimes, what we're forbidden to have is precisely what we want most desperately. For women in Rome, especially women of the upper classes, life was highly constrained. They had no political power. They couldn't vote. They couldn't hold office. They couldn't own property in their own names. Even their bodies weren't entirely their own. Once married, they were essentially the property of their husbands. Their primary function was to produce heirs. Their role was to maintain the household and bear children. Their sexuality was controlled. Their movements were restricted. They were expected to be modest, chaste, obedient. For such women, a gladiator represented something radically different. A man who was celebrated by the crowds. A man whose body was the source of his value and his fame. A man who had achieved status not through family connections or political maneuvering, but through physical prowess and the ability to entertain. A man who, despite his legal status as enslaved, occupied a position of cultural power that was unprecedented. Everyone knew who the famous gladiators were. Everyone talked about them. Everyone watched them. Everyone desired them. And most importantly, a man who was fundamentally unavailable in the terms that mattered. A woman could never marry a gladiator, could never have a legitimate relationship with him, could never bear his children and have those children inherit status or wealth. The relationship was inherently temporary, inherently transgressive, inherently doomed. And perhaps for that reason, it was all the more desirable. The evidence from Pompeii suggests that some women actively pursued these relationships. They attended the gladiatorial games. They made themselves visible. They wrote their declarations on walls where other people could see them. They sent love notes. They arranged meetings. They risked their reputations, their marriages, their social standing for the chance to be with a man they desired. What's particularly interesting is that these relationships appear to have operated relatively openly in some cases. The graffiti was public. The notes, while private, could be discovered and read by others. This suggests that while these relationships violated social rules, there may have been a kind of tolerance for them, a recognition that this was something that happened, a kind of accepting of the inevitable crossing of boundaries that occurred when women and gladiators were forced into proximity. The amphitheater itself was one space where crossing boundaries was possible. Elite women attended the games, often occupying specific seating sections. Gladiators trained and appeared in public. The barrier between the audience and the performers was thin. Eye contact was possible. Attraction could develop. And in a society where interactions between women and men of different classes were supposed to be impossible, the amphitheater created a space where they could at least see each other, where desire could be acknowledged. Some historians have suggested that the relationship between elite women and gladiators can be understood as an inversion of power dynamics. In their marriages, elite women were subordinate to men of their own class. In their homes, they were controlled by husbands and fathers. In public, they were restricted and confined. But with a gladiator, a woman could occupy a position of power. She could initiate the contact. She could control when and where the relationship occurred. She could end it. In a society where women had no power, a forbidden relationship with a man of low status was one of the few ways a woman could exercise agency and control. The gladiator, for his part, was in a complex position. He was enslaved. He had no legal rights. He could be killed at any moment. But he also had something that elite men of his era rarely had. He had the knowledge that he was desired. He had the power to attract admiration. He had women of status pursuing him. In a perverse way, his powerlessness created a kind of power. He could not be controlled in the way that free men could be controlled. He could not be bound by the social rules that governed relationships between free people of the same class. He occupied a space outside of society, and in that space, he had a freedom of a sort that even elite men didn't have. The relationship between elite women and gladiators therefore represented a kind of escape for both parties. For the women, it was a way to experience desire, control, and power in relationships where they normally experienced none of these things. For the gladiators, it was a way to experience being valued and desired as something other than a performer in the arena. It was a way to have agency, at least in this one domain, despite their legal enslavement. But it was also enormously risky. For a woman, discovery could mean social ruin. It could mean divorce. It could mean being cast out of elite society. It could mean losing her wealth and her position. For a gladiator, the risks were less clear. He was already enslaved. He had little to lose in terms of status, but he could be punished severely for involving himself with an elite woman. He could be sold or transferred to a worse position. He could even be executed if his owner deemed it appropriate. The evidence from the walls of Pompeii captures a moment in time, a moment when these transgressive relationships were happening, when women were writing declarations of love to gladiators, when men and women from different social classes were acknowledging their desire for each other in ways that violated every rule of Roman society. And then, in an instant, it all ended. Vesuvius erupted. The ash fell. The city was buried. And these relationships, these forbidden connections, were preserved in the plaster of the walls. Preserved for nearly 2,000 years, waiting for archaeologists to discover them and piece together the story. What's remarkable is that it took nearly 2,000 years for these stories to be acknowledged. For much of the history of archaeological study in Pompeii, scholars focused on the grand structures, the forum, the amphitheater, the houses of the wealthy, the artwork. The graffiti about gladiators and forbidden desire was often dismissed or minimized. It wasn't considered important enough to study carefully. It was considered the scribblings of the lower classes, not worth serious historical attention. But in recent decades, as the field of archaeology has shifted to focus more on the lives of ordinary people, as historians have become interested in social history rather than just the history of great events and great people, the graffiti has been re-examined. And what emerges is a much more complex picture of Roman society than we typically get. A picture where social boundaries were, despite all the rules and regulations, permeable. A picture where people crossed lines despite the risks. A picture where forbidden desire was powerful enough to overcome social restrictions. The women who wrote declarations of love to gladiators were taking an enormous risk. They were risking their marriages. They were risking their social standing. They were risking their wealth and their position in society. And yet they did it anyway. They wrote the words. They arranged the meetings. They pursued the relationships. What does that tell us about the nature of desire? What does that tell us about the power of social transgression? It tells us that humans are capable of violating the rules that society creates, even when the consequences are severe. It tells us that desire doesn't respect social boundaries. It tells us that people, even people with tremendous power and privilege, will sometimes risk everything for a connection they want. It tells us something about the ways that the powerless can, in certain contexts, exercise power over the powerful. A gladiator, enslaved and without rights, could nonetheless make an elite woman desire him. He could make her want to cross boundaries. He could make her take risks. That is a form of power, a form that doesn't show up in the official structures of Roman society, but that was nonetheless real. The graffiti of Pompeii reveals that the rigid social hierarchy of Rome was, in practice, more complex than the official rules suggest. People found ways to cross boundaries. People found ways to express desire and pursue connection despite the rules forbidding it. The city was preserved in volcanic ash before those desires could be fully explored or before the relationships could fully develop or end. But the evidence remains, carved into the walls, written in love notes, documented in graffiti, the story of transgression, the story of forbidden desire, the story of people who were willing to risk everything to be with someone they wanted. But there are other forms of transgression, other ways that boundaries are crossed, and some of them are far darker than forbidden desire. Some involve the deliberate cultivation of fear. Some involve the systematic elimination of threats. Some involve the use of sexual power combined with political ruthlessness to maintain dominance and control. Throughout history, certain women have understood that power doesn't come only from seduction or manipulation in the gentle sense. Power also comes from the willingness to eliminate competition. Power comes from making others afraid. Power comes from combining sexual allure with the capacity for violence. Power comes from understanding that being desirable can make a man vulnerable and being willing to exploit that vulnerability. There was a woman in history who understood this better than almost anyone. A woman who used her sexuality to attract the most powerful men of her era. A woman who then used her knowledge of these men's desires against them. A woman who, when those men became threats to her power, had the capacity and the willingness to have them removed. In our next video, we're going to explore the hidden history of women who wielded power not through charm or intellectual brilliance alone, but through the deliberate cultivation of fear combined with sexual allure. We're going to examine accounts of women throughout history who achieved and maintained power through ruthlessness. We're going to confront the idea that sometimes the most powerful women in history were not the ones who loved wisely or seduced strategically, but the ones who were willing to do whatever it took to maintain their authority. The ones who understood that love and desire were tools, and that tools could be used to eliminate obstacles. If the story of Pompeii's forbidden desires unsettled you, if it changed how you think about power and transgression and the ways that social boundaries are violated, wait until you see what comes next, because we're about to enter the territory of women who understood that desire can be weaponized. Women who understood that men's attraction to them could be turned against them. Women who were willing to sacrifice anyone to maintain their grip on power. Subscribe right now. Turn on notifications, because next week we're exploring the darkest side of feminine power, the side that isn't discussed in traditional histories. The side that reveals what women are capable of when they decide that power is worth any price. Thank you for watching Shadow of Empires. If the graffiti of Pompeii revealed to you a different side of Roman society, if it showed you that social boundaries are more permeable than we think, if it challenged your understanding of power and desire, hit like, subscribe, and comment telling us which historical figure you want exposed next. Because history is filled with stories of transgression, stories of people crossing boundaries, stories of forbidden desire and the consequences that follow. We'll see you in the next one.